Just to give you a quick sense of what was going on. Should cut that slide. So that's actually the cover of the hardcover, this one. You can kill the slide, the screen now. I don't really integrate slides. I'm kind of old school. Periodically, at least 11 times in the last 100 years, a new influenza virus has jumped species from another animal into humans and caused a pandemic, of course, most recently in 2009. But in the last 20 years, an additional half dozen or so viruses from animals have infected humans. Birds are the natural reservoir for all influenza viruses, and the most worrisome, two viruses have infected, since 2004, about 2,500 people and killed 1,500 people. It's a 60% mortality rate. So far, all of the humans have been infected directly from close contact with birds, with very few exceptions from intimate contact with their family members. If either of those viruses were to acquire the ability to transmit easily between humans, obviously we would have a problem. Because of binding sites on the virus and human cells, it probably wouldn't be 60% mortality, fortunately, but it might very well be something like 1918. That's why when Tom Frieden left CDC and was asked what gave him nightmares, he said, quote, "Influenza. It's always the worst case scenario. Even a moderate pandemic, as Tom was saying, could infect 60 to 100 million Americans, a couple of billion people worldwide, and cause millions of deaths." And something like a worst case scenario did occur in 1918. Roughly 2/3 of the 50 to 100 million dead, and you adjust for population, that would be about 225 million to 450 million people today. Roughly 2/3 of them died in about 14 weeks. Normally, influenza kills the very young and elderly. In 1918, the elderly escaped almost untouched. 2/3 of the deaths were adults aged roughly 18 to 45. The peak year was 28. In virgin populations, areas that had never seen an influenza virus, things were much worse. In one village in Alaska, for example, 72 out of 80 people died in 5 days. In the Fiji Islands, 14% of the entire population died in 16 days. The symptoms mimic typhoid, cholera, dengue. You could bleed not only from your nose and mouth, but from your eyes and ears. Deaths occurred in 24 hours or less. To give you a more intimate sense of what it was like, I'll read you a letter from a doctor at Camp Devins in Massachusetts to a colleague. "These men start with what appears to be an ordinary attack of influenza, but when brought to the hospital, they very rapidly develop the most vicious type of pneumonia that has ever been seen. A few hours after admission, you can begin to see the cyanosis extending from the ears and spreading over the face until it is hard to distinguish the colored men from the white. It is only a matter of a few hours then until death comes. Pneumonia means in about all cases death. We've been averaging 100 deaths per day. It takes special trains to take away the dead. For several days there were no coffins and the bodies piled up something fierce. It beats any sight they ever had in France after a battle. Goodbye, old pal. God be with you till we meet again." That was the disease. Now, the course of every disease in an individual depends upon the interaction between the etiological agent and the host. Similarly, the course of any disease outbreak depends on the interaction between the causative agent and the host society. In 1918, the host society was at war. Wilson declared, quote, It isn't an army we must shape and train for war. It is a nation. Creatures of disloyalty and anarchy must be crushed out. Emerson said that an institution is the lengthened shadow of one man. Wilson's shadow fell upon the government and, in turn, the country. Probably more than at any other time in our history, whether it was the McCarthy period, World War II, Civil War, the U.S. government demanded loyalty of its citizens. Congress passed a law making it punishable by 20 years in prison to, quote, utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the form of government of the United States. A U.S. congressman was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison under that law. At the same time, concerned with keeping morale up, Wilson created something called the Committee for Public Information, and the architect of that committee said that truth and falsehood are arbitrary terms. It makes very little difference whether something is true or false, only its impact matters. So they had 100,000 what they called 4 Minutemen who spoke before every public meeting, a gathering like this, a vaudeville show, a movie theater, a school board meeting, and would give a brief, uplifting comment. At a time when states were banning the teaching of German, army camps were banning songs like, quote, like I Wonder Who's Kissing Her Now, the virus entered this societal host. In September 1918, as it spread all across the country, public health leaders lied. The Surgeon General said, "There's no cause for alarm if proper precautions are observed." Another national health official said, "The so-called Spanish influenza is nothing more or less than old-fashioned grip." These pronouncements were echoed almost everywhere, and that same official position held forth no matter how bad circumstances get. Philadelphia was one of the hardest hit cities, and mass graves, in fact, one of the slides was here in Philadelphia, mass graves being dug by steam shovels. Priests here were literally driving horse-drawn carts down the street, calling upon people to bring out their dead. When the public health director finally closed schools, closed saloons, banned church services, canceled sporting events, banned all public gatherings, one of the newspapers here actually said, "This is not a public health measure. You have no cause for alarm." So how stupid did they think people were? People certainly knew this was not ordinary influenza by another name. As fear spread, trust in authority disintegrated, and fear and distrust always make up a potent combination. I think that ultimately society is based on trust, and without it, you find only alienation and disintegration. That's what occurred. In most disasters, you see communities coming together. You see people behaving heroically and finding humanity in each other. In 1918, without any guidance from any authority as to what the true situation was or what to do, it became everyone for himself or herself. The head of volunteer efforts in a major city could find no one who volunteered. She said, quote, "Hundreds of women had the vanity to imagine they were capable of great sacrifice. Nothing seems to rouse them now. They know families in which every member is ill, in which children are actually starving because there is no one to give them food. Still, they hold back." Now, this was occurring not only in large cities, in rural communities where family and community was supposed to be everything. Similar events were occurring. As the Red Cross reported, quote, "People starving to death not from lack of food, but because the well are afraid to go near the sick." Society began to break down. Quote, "The fear was so great, people were actually afraid to leave their homes. It completely destroyed all family and community life. You couldn't play with your playmates, your classmates, your neighbors. You had no school life. You had no church life. People were afraid to kiss one another, afraid to eat with one another. You were constantly afraid. You were quarantined by constant fear. One of the slides that I showed, you may not have noted it, there was a picture of Manhattan with 2 city workers with masks. There were cars parked on the curb, but there was not a single car moving on the street. There was not a single pedestrian on the sidewalk. Very undramatic picture until you start to think about it. There's here in Philly again, Isaac Starr was a physician working in an emergency hospital, lived 12 miles away. When he saw so few cars on the road on his way home every night, he started counting them. One night, drive of 12 miles, 3rd biggest city in the country, he didn't see a single other car on the road. He said the life of the city is almost stopped. Roughly the same time in the pandemic, in Wellington, New Zealand, a doctor stepped outside his emergency hospital at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, saw nothing moving on the street. He said, it's become a city of the dead. Victor Vaughn is dean of the University of Michigan Medical School, a sober, serious scientist not given to overstatement, said, if this continues the rate of acceleration for a few more weeks, civilization could easily disappear from the face of the earth. Now, it didn't continue. That was 100 years ago. What's happened since? For one thing, of course, we developed a vaccine. It's not a very good vaccine. Measles and yellow fever are roughly 99% effective. Influenza vaccine effectiveness varies from year to year. It has ranged from the best ever, 60%, down to 10% effectiveness. For the elderly, on several occasions, unfortunately, and those including myself who need it the most, it's been 0% effective. We've also developed antivirals, which have very limited success or effectiveness. You could ask yourself, why is this the case? First, the difficulty the virus itself presents. You'll hear more about that later. As a good friend of mine says, he knows much less, a virologist, influenza expert, he knows much less about influenza today than he did 10 years ago. We just keep learning more about its complexity. But the other reason is that for decades, influenza was not taken seriously. You saw Tom's number about how many seasonal deaths there were. The West Nile virus, in its worst year, killed 283 Americans. Guess which disease got more funding from the federal government for research? It was, of course, West Nile, or I wouldn't have said it. That was until 2004. In 2004, H5N1, one of those 2 bird flu viruses, resurfaced with a vengeance, and all of a sudden, influenza was taken very, very seriously by governments around the world. Since then, in the United States alone, there have been about $4 billion invested in influenza. The bulk of that money actually went to infrastructure, such things as improving vaccine manufacturing technology and creating some in the United States, because most of the vaccines were imported. Also, surveillance of new viruses, stockpiling antivirals, and making vaccines against potential pandemic viruses. All those things help a little bit, but they are definitely not the answer. I'll skip why, because I'm running out of time. This, incidentally, is the only talk I've ever given where the audience sees a clock. That's very intimidating. I don't mind ignoring this. Okay, the second area of investment is one I've been personally involved in, and that's trying to figure out what public health measures to take to mitigate a pandemic. And most of these, we've developed quite a few recommendations, whether referred to as non-pharmaceutical interventions, NPIs, what you do when you don't have drugs. Most of them relate to social distancing, a self-explanatory word. I support them. I was part of the effort that came up with them, but I'm much less optimistic than most other people about how effective they're going to be. Most of the others are modelers. I look at the real world data in 1918. I have, number one, I think some of the positive results that have been attributed to public health measures in 1918, I think, have other better explanations. For another thing, the effectiveness of any measure is going to depend on risk communication to gain compliance. Without compliance, it's not any good. And that compliance has to be sustained for weeks. If you look at Mexico in 2009, the government recommended masks on public transit. Masks or something else I don't think are much use, but regardless, they gave them away for free at subway stops and bus stops and so forth. Compliance peaked at 65% 3 days after the announcement. 4 days later, compliance was 27%. 4 days. So sustained compliance is necessary because it's going to be a period of weeks that a virus is moving through a community. In fact, the most important lesson, in my view, from 1918 in terms of public health involves risk communication, which is a phrase I don't much care for because it implies managing the truth. I don't think you manage the truth, I think you tell the truth. Earlier, I had suggested that telling the truth would have kept society cohesive, integrated, and functioning. That hypothesis is actually supported by what turned out to be almost a perfect control in 1918. San Francisco, unlike practically every other city in the country, took it seriously. The mayor, city council, business leaders, labor leaders all put their names on a big full-page ad in the newspaper, huge print, wear a mask and save your life. Now again, the mask didn't do any good, but that's a very different message than this is ordinary influenza by another name. And San Francisco functioned. When they closed schools, the teachers volunteered for things like everything from ambulance drivers to telephone operators wherever they were needed. Blocks were organized, nobody starved, and so forth. So I think that control supports the hypothesis. And truth-telling is incorporated in every pandemic plan I know about, federal level, state level, local level. But even if you have a perfect message and a perfect plan, executing it, staying ahead of the internet and so forth, will depend on some political leader making the right decision. In 2009 in Mexico, the National Emergency Management Head, who's designed their pandemic influenza plan, was not even allowed into the meetings where they were deciding what to do until the head of the Pan American Health Organization insisted that they include that person, or they wouldn't get any help from PAHO. And Mexico actually performed pretty rationally in 2009. Many countries did not. You know, it's impossible to keep influenza out of a country. Yet the Chinese health minister said this is a foreign disease and we will keep it out of China. France wanted the European Union to cancel all flights to Mexico. Egypt slaughtered all pigs. Even our own CDC had a bit of an overreaction. Messaging and the messenger prevent a very, very serious challenge with even a moderate pandemic, much less a serious one. The third area of investment since 2004 is most promising. This involves research. The major questions remain both in terms of epidemiology. Again, for time, I'm going to have to skip some of these. Some of these do require interdisciplinary approaches where even an historian might have some contribution. Others involve the laboratory. And to sum up, where are we now? A strong case can be made, unfortunately, that we are more vulnerable today to even a moderate pandemic than we used to be. For several reasons. Again, time means I can only mention one, and that is just-in-time inventory. In 1918, you had 40 to 60% absenteeism. Cut that in half. Take out production line workers, take out air traffic controllers, truck drivers. What happens to your just-in-time inventory? Healthcare is actually one of the most vulnerable areas. They import practically every drug, every hypodermic needle, every surgical gown, but every industry would be affected by the efficiency that we've developed in just-in-time inventory. So what is the answer? It rests really in the hands of the next several speakers. It rests in the laboratory, and that is in a universal vaccine, a vaccine that will work against almost every influenza virus. Now, if we had taken influenza seriously over the decades, instead of spending money on West Nile, maybe we'd have one by now. I know that there is great optimism, and I share that optimism, and I leave it to the next speakers to take care of you all and me. Thank you.
George Woolreich, Philadelphia. Professor Kathleen Holt Jameson may be in the room, so I'm embarrassed to say this with her possibly being present. But one of the things that did not appear to obtain in 1918 was what we are seeing much more now, and that is purposeful disinformation. And I wondered if you have had any thoughts, and especially considering the greatly increased faith in government that people are demonstrating.
Well, I would dispute that. I would say saying this is ordinary influenza by another name is purposeful disinformation. So, I mean, I actually just disagree with that. But you add the confusion and concern, and in some cases outright panic, to the internet, and you have a problem. I gave a talk before a pandemic game in California. I won't mention the city. And I was emphasizing, because this is all public health and what were we going to do next, I was emphasizing even more than I did in this talk probably, telling the truth. And the first move in this pandemic game was, okay, we have a case that maybe pandemic flu has just surfaced in the city. The first case, what are you going to do? And the response from move one, from the public health director, was, well, we're not sure this is pandemic influenza, there's nothing to worry about. Well, everybody had just applauded my speech. And what that public health director said was true. We didn't know. But what the message, he's already behind the curve. What the message should have been, it really doesn't matter because it's coming. We won't know until we run various tests, which nowadays pretty quickly analyze the genome and so forth and get answers pretty rapidly. But that should have been the message. It doesn't matter, it's coming. We're prepared, and this is what you have to do. Obviously, if you have certain occupants in, look, during the Ebola scare, I live in Louisiana, our Attorney General, whom I know and is sort of a friend, he wanted to close the borders of Louisiana. There were crazy reactions to Ebola. So it is a concern. Purposeful disinformation did obtain in 1918, not only in influenza, but in more general ways regarding the war. But I'll cut myself off so I'll have time for more questions. Am I supposed to identify?
Oh, Annette Gordon-Reed. I know that influenza comes from animal to human transmission, but I thought it was more animals than birds. Did you say that?
Well, the bird virus, birds can infect basically all, horses. Jeff Taubenberger has done great work with horses, as a matter of fact. Seals, pigs, pigs have receptors for both human viruses, what have become human viruses, and bird viruses, so they're referred to as a mixing bowl. One of the interesting things about the influenza virus, in addition to its rapid mutation rate, most organisms, their genetic information is on a continuous strand. Influenza's genetic information is on 8 separate segments. So if 2 different viruses infect the same cell, they can reassort. It's like taking 2 decks of cards, shuffling them and come out with that's a reassortment virus, and that's when you get swine flu in 2009. There are some people think that 1918 went directly from birds. That is now a minority view. I'm not a virologist, so I won't have my own opinion on this. But most of the genes in the 1918 virus are from avian. But it probably did go through a mixing bowl. I think that's the general view now. I don't know if Jeff or Peter have different views on that.
Okay. Mary Beth Norton, Cornell. John, I'd like to make a sort of a long historical point, which is that, of course, one of the things that really early American historians have discovered is how damaging influenza pandemics were to the native populations of the Americas when the Europeans first arrived. Of course, those were virgin soil epidemics, but the emphasis has always been on smallpox, but I wonder if you could comment on whether if we pay more attention to the fact that a lot of those deaths were actually due to influenza, it might actually help to bring the danger home to people today.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. In 1580, you don't need airplanes to have a pandemic. In 1580, a pandemic managed to make it from Europe to the Americas. In 1688, the same year as the Glorious Revolution, another pandemic made it to Virginia, where, quote, people died as in a plague, unquote. They were used to plagues. And in the virgin population, they'd never seen an influenza virus. You're absolutely correct. It was second to smallpox. Distant second to smallpox. Smallpox could wipe out 90% of a population. I don't have an actual number, but it was pretty significant. I wouldn't be surprised if influenza wasn't, as it did in, for example, Western Samoa, it killed roughly over 20% of the entire population in 1918. I would think you would get similar results from Native Americans in both North and South America.
So we have time for one more question.
Well, does the president get one?
Sounds a good idea.
Balcony. Balcony.
Oh, one from the balcony. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Michael McCormick, Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm part of a research group, the Max Planck Harvard Research Center for Archaeoscience, that is working now intensively on ancient pandemics, particularly bubonic plague in the late Roman Empire and in the medieval period, the Black Death era. And one of the questions that has arisen that your experience of 1918 may be very helpful to elucidating for us is what kind of mid and long-term effects does one see after the immediate intense mortality has passed? Can one see economic consequences in the midterm or the longer term inflections of the development of society, economy, social relations, institutions, and mentalities?
Well, because of the war in the West, which is the only place we really have data, it's very difficult to pinpoint. You had a brief depression, then you had the roaring 20s and so forth. You had the shift of manufacture from war material to, pent-up demand. So it's hard to pin that or isolate that, pull that out. I know about models, what would happen to the economy today in a pandemic, based on the disruption of just-in-time inventory, the very significant impacts on production and economic growth and so forth. I will say that, clearly there was a lasting impact in the head of people. For example, when the Nazis entered Berlin, Christopher Isherwood, in 1933, Isherwood said you could feel it like influenza in the bones. The very fact that that's in his head 15 years later, and the analogy that he's making, I think is kind of interesting. But quantitatively from 1918, I don't know. 57, 68, 2009, Mexico spent $180 million on the pandemic. It actually suffered $9 billion in economic losses because basically other countries penalized it for telling the truth and being the source. If it was the source, it's possible California was the source, probably Mexico, but it could have been California. The first laboratory findings were actually in California, in San Diego. So certainly it had a significant impact on Mexico. And, I just sort of filibustered, didn't really answer your question. I should have just said, I don't know.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.